Hello, my gorgeous people. Today I wanted to talk about something that has been in the background of a few of my videos recently, and that is the StoryGraph Reads the World Challenge 2025. The StoryGraph as a platform is also something that I've talked about, but as an overview, it is a really great non-Amazon owned book tracking platform and also a bit of a book community where you can hold reading challenges. So it's a pretty great alternative to Goodreads if you want to go ahead and support something that has no links to Amazon. One thing that drew me to the StoryGraph as a platform is also that they held their own reading challenges, and one of these reading challenges being the StoryGraph Reads the World. So 2025 is their 4th year of running this challenge. I did do 2024 and absolutely loved it, and that's why I decided I wanted to go ahead and do it for 2025 and also talk through the 10 books that I read for this challenge. So the goal of the StoryGraph Reads the World Challenge is to read a book set in that country by an author from that country. And the StoryGraph choose 10 different countries each year for these books to be set in. And the overarching aim of this challenge is to read books that are set outside of the UK and the US, which currently kind of dominate the publishing world. You can also read books from the diaspora of these countries, but they do try and recommend that you stick to authors from that country. Another good opportunity for this challenge is to read literature in translation, which is also one of my existing interests anyway, so this is why this challenge is so fun for me, is broadening my literary horizons. And I think the ultimate goal is to then read a book from every country in the world, depending on how long they run this challenge for. So yeah, I want to talk about the 10 books that I read for this year's challenge. I think I completed this back in end of August, and I'm gonna say I technically completed this challenge. I did have a few issues fully completing this. I'm gonna say potentially bent the rules for one of these countries. So the 10 countries that they chose for this year was Australia, Belgium, China, Egypt, Iceland, Kenya, Malaysia, Mexico, the Netherlands, and the Philippines. So a pretty diverse range here. And I'm going to go in the order that I read these books, because I did not approach the challenge as 1 to 10. I approached it as whatever books I owned first or that I may have already been reading that aligned with the challenge, and then picking out whatever was available at my local library. So I actually only own one book for this challenge that I read, and that was for China, because that aligned with a book that I was already reading. And that was The Husky and His White Cat Season, Volume 7 by Niban. So I finished this January 8th, so a very early start to the challenge where I was like, oh, well, I'm already reading a book set in China by a Chinese author. I'm trying to think of a good plot overview of The Husky and His White Cat Season. So obviously I'm not going to give a plot overview of Volume 7, but really the overarching story of The Husky and His White Cat Season is we follow our main character Mo Ran, who is a very cruel emperor committed many dastardly deeds, horrific things, who opens up the beginning of the novel by committing suicide, except he is then reborn into his own past. So we're talking ancient Chinese cultivation, magical stuff. And he is essentially given a second chance to live his life and try things again. And the main crux of the story is also that he follows his cultivation teacher called Chu Wanning, who he has a complicated relationship with, who is essentially the crux of why he turned a certain way in his past life. So it's one of those reborn stories, second chance stories, but it is very interesting. I'm in the Dan May hole, guys, so this made sense for me to just say, right, I'm already in Volume 7, let's count this as China. And I gave Volume 7 4.5. I'm going to be really honest, I cannot for the life of me remember what actually happens in Volume 7. It's been a while. Oh, this one's a heartbreaking volume from what I remember, but yeah, these are absolutely gorgeous covers. We love them. So yeah, how I approached the rest of these countries for books that I didn't already own is that I figured I don't want to go and buy a book just for a reading challenge that I don't think I actually want to fully go and read or own this book myself. So what I did is I went onto my local library database and I searched by country. And I didn't try to filter by fiction or nonfiction, because I think that this challenge is also a great opportunity to go and read some nonfiction books that you may not typically read. But the issue here is that libraries are weirdly stocked. So you often search for a certain country, you'll end up with a lot of nonfiction travel guides, for example. So I had to be really selective with what I chose, and some of them were just books that I would genuinely not even read for a challenge. So there were a lot of children's books. For some of these countries as well, I would find that there would be a lot slipping through the gaps where it would be written by British or American authors about that country, especially a lot of war novels, for example. And I was like, no, that doesn't fit the criteria of this challenge. So I tackled Iceland next, and I read The Mark by Frida Isberg. This was a disappointing one for me. The premise was very interesting. It is almost giving vibes of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. So this is a novel set in a near-future Iceland where the Icelandic Psychological Association have created what they call a sensitivity assessment. And the novel is set in a period where there's a very imminent vote on whether it should be a compulsory test for all Icelandic citizens. And this test tests your empathy and identifying potential for future antisocial behavior. So we're in a nation that's like very much divided about whether or not this is a good thing, making it compulsory, where some say it's a really great indicator for who we should trust in society and others call it, a violation of data, trust, or that it's a bunch of pseudoscience. And we follow 4 different characters in the build-up to this vote. From what I can remember, one of them is someone who's involved in the administration of the vote. Another one is from the association themselves. One of the perspectives is from a boy who has failed the test. And I cannot remember what the 4th perspective is, which is probably quite telling of how much I enjoyed this book. What's interesting is that even before this test has become compulsory nationwide, is that there's already segregation policies in place. So you have certain apartment buildings and schools, for example, that you cannot get into if A, you haven't done the sensitivity assessment, or B, if you failed the sensitivity assessment. So there's a lot of commentary on segregation, and clearly is quite an easy comparison to class and race. But my main comments is that when I was around 200 pages into this book, I just felt that there were too many characters and too many character motivations to keep track of, so it kind of got a bit confusing and I forgot what everyone was doing. One of my other main comments is that I wasn't sure if this was due to the fact that I am not used to Icelandic names. So, there's only 4 characters that you're following, but each of these 4 characters obviously have other characters surrounding them. And all of these names kind of blended into one for me, which is not a great sign, but this was my first time reading an Icelandic book, and I'm not really familiar with Icelandic names. And at that point of the book, I really had no clue where this book would finish, where they would take the plot. I think ultimately they didn't really take the plot anywhere. My issue with this book is that I didn't feel like this book had anywhere to go. There was a very weak resolution or ending, and it didn't really improve the longer that the book went on. And also it inflated with these characters that I didn't really care too much about or feel a deep connection to. I mean, I've read a lot of books since reading this because I finished this February 24th. So there's a chance that I just don't remember much of this book because it's been a while since I've read it. I don't think I felt like I got much out of it. So I gave this book 2.5 stars out of 5, so quite a low ranking for me. It was an interesting foray into Iceland's literature, but probably not the best thing to base my opinions on. The next book I tackled was for Kenya, and this was The Girls in the Wild Fig Tree by Nice Langete. The full name of the book actually is The Girls in the Wild Fig Tree, How I Fought to Save Myself, My Sister, and Thousands of Girls Worldwide. This one, non-fiction, naturally. This one really compelled me when I found it on my library database, so I went and got it. I've actually fucked up the timings. This was the 2nd book that I went and did, not the 3rd, but whatever. I didn't really journal this one as I went through and read it, so it was more of a retrospective review. But this book was super inspiring to me, and Nice Langete has like a really amazing voice, very easy to follow in terms of the storytelling aspect. But what this talks about is how essentially Nice managed to, over many years and with a lot of dedication and hard work, change her village elders' opinions on female genital mutilation, also known as the cut. Tackles a lot of difficult topics, and it made me upset and angry a lot of the time. But like I said, Nice has like a really positive, beautiful voice. I think this was just a great book, really eye-opening to me. I felt like I learned a lot. I did have a basic understanding of FGM and how it's practiced in different countries, but not a huge in-depth knowledge, particularly in individual Kenyan villages where a lot of different traditions come into play, and a lot of also different social impacts when it comes to talking about feminism and patriarchy and how these are upheld in different ways, but how a lot of these are held in kind of these deeply rooted traditional family values that are very hard to turn your back on, even when you know that these practices are illegal and immoral. And how do you battle your knowledge that this is wrong, but you want to respect your elders? It was a really compelling book. She also has a few TED Talks up, and I went and watched these afterwards, and I feel like the book gives her TED Talks and her stories so much more depth. She's a good speaker, but she's even better in this book. I gave this book 4.5 out of 5. Really good, really would recommend if anyone's interested in this topic or wants to learn more. The next country was Mexico, which I chose The Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Caña, and woo, this one was a journey. I think I was really excited for this one because again, it's kind of got that horror element and also vampires. So of the challenge books that I chose, this one I was a little bit more excited and maybe would have picked out without prompting. I loved this book. It was an absolute journey. I've talked about it briefly in my October spooky vlog, which I don't know if this will be out by the time I get this video out, but we'll see. But essentially we follow two characters in the 1500s who live on the Texas-Mexico border, set amongst the background of the Mexican-American War. This is ultimately a novel about colonialism and the monstrous elements of colonialism. This is also a vampire novel. The author's twist on vampires was really cool. I loved it. I know some people didn't from reading the reviews of this book and felt it was a little schlocky, but for me, I enjoyed it a lot. What I would say is that this isn't a straightforward horror. There's a lot of romance. This is probably primarily a romance book over a horror book, but I really enjoyed the horror elements of it too. There were like some genuinely very creepy, scary imagery in here that I was not expecting. A little bit of a spoiler, but like there's a particular battlefield scene where you have like this really in-depth, emotional, harrowing descriptions of war and the battlefield. And then on the outskirts of this battlefield, you just have fucking vampires. Creature-esque, fucking tall, scary vampires. Oh my goodness, that imagery was really scary to me and really well done. I am going to say that the romance aspect of this book, it didn't necessarily feel forced, but I don't think it was my type of romance, and it put me off a little bit from the book. And I'd say that is probably what dropped this star rating from a 5 to a 4.5. So yeah, 4.5 for Mexico's book. Enjoyed this one, and I would recommend it for people who like the intersection of horror and romance. I then went on to read Malaysia's entry, and the book I chose for that was Blackwater Sister by Zhen Cho. The premise of this book sounded really exciting to me, so when I got around to actually reading it, I was very disappointed. But we essentially follow a closeted main character, Jessamine, who moves back to Malaysia with her family after struggling with some debt. And she starts hearing voices and she's chalking it up to stress and thinking, oh, I'm having like a long distance relationship, it's closeted, my family don't know I'm a lesbian, and also I've moved back to this country that I don't know super well, and I'm trying to find a job, and you know, all of this stress. Until it turns out it's her late grandmother who's speaking in her head. And her late grandmother used to be a spirit medium in Malaysia, who channeled a specific mysterious deity called the Blackwater Sister. Again, I'd say this book is kind of tackling generational trauma, family respect, families who have different goals and ideas in life and how to live it. Hi, as I'm sure you've noticed, different day, different setting. My mic turned off for 10 minutes during filming that video and I didn't notice. So future me is here to fill in the gaps. But talking about Blackwater Sister. So I was expecting more from this. Unfortunately, I just think that the writing style really wasn't my type. I felt like it was a little bit juvenile, perhaps maybe for a younger audience than myself. The way I described it in my reading journal, that there was overly simplistic and plain language and writing methods used, and I think I just prefer a bit more meat to the bones of my books. My other main critique of this book is that the plot was very slow to start, and Jess as a main character wasn't very compelling or engaging as a reader. And I actually wrote down here where I thought the plot would go at that point in the book, and I said that I was thinking the plot would follow Jess as she helps her grandmother's ghost ultimately be set to rest and stop this evil construction company built over a temple or something. Even as a potential plot overview, it sounds a little too middle grade literature for my tastes. Another element of this book is that they have kind of this common enemy within her family, and is this super rich son of a construction owner. From what I can remember, there's been a lot of like building development plans around some of like the traditional local temples, but obviously they don't want them to build over these. I thought it was going to be kind of a somewhat coming of age story where Jess's grandmother helps her accept more traditional spiritual views, whilst Jess in turn allows and gets acceptance from her grandmother as a lesbian. It was less of that. I think there was some relationship development between Jess and her grandmother's ghost, and there were some interesting aspects when, spoiler alert, Jess does end up becoming fully possessed by her grandmother, and then also allowing her grandmother to spiritually call the Blackwater Sister, and then the Blackwater Sister, if my memory serves correct, also possesses Jess. And some of those scenes were kind of horrifying. Like, I think the author did a really good job at portraying that loss of control and the horror aspect of being taken over, particularly by a scary spirit. But other than that, I felt like the plot and the pacing was just so slow. And when I finished the book, I decided, oh, I really do not like this. Even though I had some slim hopes at the beginning that the pace would pick up, and even if I thought the plot was kind of stereotypical, like it would still be somewhat interesting and have some merit, but I just think the writing was immature and undercooked. And also, I did say coming of age, but I'm pretty sure Jess, the main character, is like 18, 19 years old. It feels more like a high school student, but let me fact check myself. I will research this afterwards and verify if Jess, as the main character, is actually, a grown adult. I just felt like perhaps the writing also reflected a younger age of the main character that wasn't really to my taste. So yeah, I gave this 2 stars out of 5, pretty low score, and I don't think I'd read anything more from this author unless it was very clearly marketed as like an adult novel. So the next book for this challenge I read was The Discomfort of Evening by Lucas Reineveld. I believe that's how you pronounce his last name. And this was for the Netherlands. The cover of this really intrigued me. I think it's a beautiful cover. It is potentially the kind of book I would have picked up without being prompted to. The blurb was quite vague in a way that I always really enjoy. I'd rather know less about a book before going in and reading it, rather than a huge blurb that spoils a bunch of the plot. So I was happy to go into this one, and it said it was dark and disturbing, so I knew kind of what I was getting into. I knew that it would not be a happy book. However, I did not know it would be this fucked up. The highest praise that I can give this book is that the prose is beautiful. I cannot say that Lucas is not an amazing writer, because he clearly is. He knows what he's doing. The translation was really well done. There wasn't any times where I was confused about what was going on or felt that the choice of words was weird or felt awkward. So translation, masterfully done. Writing, masterfully done. Clearly, Lucas is a very talented writer. However, my main bugbear of this book is just the content, really. So this book's main character is Jazz, who is a 10-year-old girl living within a highly religious reformist family deep in the countryside of the Netherlands. And we open the book, her older brother goes out to ice skate on a frozen lake nearby and drowns. So pretty quick, we're thrown into the routine of a heavily religious, very traditional, strict family who are dealing with the aftermath of an incredible grief that cannot really be explained. And she also has, I believe, a younger sister and 2 older siblings. It also tackles kind of the displacement of losing one of your children while still having to care for other children who are trying to understand what has happened and how do you explain that to the younger siblings. As I said, the prose is beautiful, and I think the author portrays grief and the aftermath of a tragedy really well. And that's what I enjoyed about this book at the beginning, before we really got into the disturbing aspects of the book. I was like, wow, this is not nice, but this is pretty realistic. It's pretty deep. And you're seeing it through the eyes of a 10-year-old too. And Jazz, as a main character, is explained to see the world differently. We're seeing through a 10-year-old's eyes, who's very imaginative, but also processes events and emotions around her a little differently, whilst also dealing with a frankly abusive family who are deeply, deeply entrenched in religion. However, there came a point, and I think I mentioned this in my September TBR video, where I was really close to DNFing this book, but I was somewhat close to the end, and I think if this was not part of a challenge, that I wouldn't have finished this book. I wouldn't have pushed myself through to the end. There were multiple repeated depictions of child sexual assault and abuse and animal slaughter and animal sexual assault. To the point where I was just like, this is too much. I think I have a pretty good grip on horror and dark concepts and dark content in books. I am pretty good at dealing with these things. But this was bad, guys. This was rough. And this is why I wouldn't ever read it again, and I wouldn't ever recommend it to anyone, because it just got too dark and I wasn't really seeing or sensing the purpose in reading over and over about this 10-year-old and the abuse that she has to face from her older siblings and her father and the older men in her community. What I do think it was good at portraying is kind of the fallout post-tragedy and how this has greatly impacted this one family in multiple different ways, and how each member of this family reacts differently. But I think just the content and the way that this was portrayed was rough. Yeah, it wasn't a big enough tie-in to portray the messages of grief and trauma, and also religious trauma. I understand where the author was going with it, but for the sake of delivering that message, the darkness of the content was just not enough for me to find much thought from reading this book. I think I would be interested to see more of what this author writes, because I think it was the severity and the quantity of these events in this book that tipped me over the edge a bit and just made me think that it was indulgent rather than representative of anything needed to portray their overarching message. So I gave this 1.5 stars, which is a very low rating for me. It means that I hate a book, and I do hate this book. And the 1.5 stars goes purely to the craft of the writing. And I finished The Discomfort of Evening August 9th. Next up, I read a book on the Philippines, which was called Some People Need Killing, a memoir of murder in my country. And this was by Patricia Evangelista. This was another one I picked up from the library, and I was compelled by the title. So this book is written by a journalist, and it follows the story of a lot of these state-sanctioned killings by the Philippines government. And I think I might mispronounce his name, but it's upheld by a guy called Rodrigo Duterte. This was, a very eye-opening book about a topic that I had no real understanding or historical knowledge about, talking about kind of like the vigilante and state-sanctioned killings of citizens that they believed to be involved in the drug war. And it's set over a time period of 6 years where Evangelista, as a journalist, has gone and investigated different perspectives of people who have been victims of these state-sanctioned killings, like the family members left over or the people who've been jailed and at threat of these state-sanctioned killings, and also some insight from the government members themselves who are involved in fueling this war against drugs. I think overall the presentation of this book was quite dry. Like, it's a winding story of a lot of historical facts and then like this journalistic presentation of different interviews. Sometimes I felt myself skimming these a little bit. I think it went almost into a bit too much depth, or wasn't really presented in a way that was necessarily hugely engaging to me. Despite this, I'd still say it's very emotive and factually displays a lot of empathy towards people affected by this and people who have continued to be affected by this. But you can tell that the author is a journalist. I found myself at times a little bit lost amongst all the different policies and political leaders because we jump around in time quite a bit, and I don't have any knowledge of the Philippines history, to be honest. So as an introductory way of understanding the war against drugs in the Philippines and also like political happenings, it's probably not the easiest to get into. And I think that's what I struggle with the most. And by the end, it does this interesting thing where it wraps up each of the perspectives that Evangelista has interviewed across the years. But like at that point, I was so wrapped up with like all these different perspectives that I kind of forgot what happened to who and who these people were. And yeah, it made a very nice conclusion, but it took me a while to kind of understand where all these different people sat in the wider narrative and the story of the book, because it was just so like heavy in its content and in its tone that yeah, it took a lot of time for me to pass through what was actually going on. To be honest, I think my main criticism of the book actually is that I wish that the author had inserted herself a bit more as a figure in this book. Like, I wanted to know a bit more about Evangelista as a person and her thoughts and her involvement in these interviews and her experiences as well, like witnessing these horrific events. I feel like she does do this, but not enough. I wanted more. Despite these criticisms, I think this is still like a great informative read, especially if you have some background knowledge of this. I think it would be much more interesting and probably easier to follow. I gave this 4 stars out of 5. Yeah, and I thoroughly enjoyed it despite my criticisms. And then I went and finished Some People Need Killing August 12th. So I read these 2 in very quick succession, and then to go on to Australia, the next country. I think I was thinking I want to get through some more of my StoryGraph challenge. So for Australia, I chose All That's Left Unsaid by Tracy Lian. So this is another fiction book set in 1980s Australia in a Vietnamese community. And the plot is that our main character Key's younger brother has just been murdered. Everyone involved in the murder who's witnessed it is keeping locked down. They're not saying a single thing about the murder. So she's figuring out that there's something fishy involved here. So we've got like a bit of a detective story going on here where the sister then goes and tries to find out herself who murdered her brother and why. I thought this was an interesting one. Again, I feel like it was maybe a little bit too young for me, which sounds strange because like it is a story ultimately about murder and grief and trauma and racism. I just didn't really feel like I got a huge amount from this book. It was enjoyable, but it wasn't anything special to talk about. I don't regret reading this. I'm going to say that some of the overarching messaging on generational trauma trauma, racism within small communities, particularly within this time period, were a little too heavy-handed for me to fully enjoy or feel like there was any grace given to us as readers to unpack that ourselves. It felt like almost condescending, like a lot of the characters felt somewhat stereotypical in a way to try and portray those messages rather than like slipping in these themes in a more natural way. The thing about this book is that you also switch perspectives, so you're not always coming from Key's perspective either. You've got perspectives of the witnesses of her brother's murder, and that was interesting, but I'm not sure that the author successfully pulled this off every perspective switch. So you get a perspective from a little girl who's witnessed the murder, which is, again, a compelling perspective where you've got like perhaps somewhat of an unreliable narrator here. I feel like that chapter in particular dragged on a little too long, and I was kind of like, I understand, but I'm not really bought into this little girl's story. Like, this is not what I'm here for. I'm not reading this book to hear about that. Like, I felt like it stalled the plot a little bit when really we're kind of looking a bit at a murder mystery story. We also have Key's ex-best friend who's kind of like hovering in the background of her brain the entire story. And then obviously like there's a reveal at the end, and like that felt just way too obvious to see coming. It just felt like a little bit uninspired. I'd say that this was like a somewhat average book, and it was interesting to learn more about this very specific insular Vietnamese Australian community in the, did I say 80s? I can't remember if it's the 1980s or the 1990s. It was interesting, and I think that's where I got most of the value out of this book. And I ranked this 3.5 out of 5. So we have 2 more countries to cover, and that is Egypt and Belgium. So for Egypt, I chose You Bury Me by Alam. And this is a play. So I was excited for this one because it's like a shorter book, and also I barely read any plays. This is definitely the first and only play that I've read in 2025, so far at least. I don't typically gravitate towards reading plays. I think it's not really a medium that I explore much, but after reading this, it's definitely one that I'd like to explore further. And I was drawn to this book because I knew that there were heavy LGBTQ themes, and that's a natural way for me to get to want to read a book. You Bury Me is a very short play following 6 young Egyptians who are navigating their young lives, friendship, queer dating, so on and so forth. I don't really want to go too much further into it because it's so short. I feel like it's just going to go straight into spoiler territory. I found this like a very refreshing read. I really enjoyed most of the characters, and I liked the diversity of the play, naturally. The dialogue, which is arguably like the main part that you're getting when you're reading a play's transcript rather than seeing it performed, was great. Very natural dialogue. Alam seems like a wonderful writer. My main thought, and this is potentially something when you're not seeing the play being performed and you're reading a play, is that the scenes all cumulatively felt quite short. I don't feel like we really had time to sit and drink in, the setting and the character interactions, but that might just be my reading speed as well. I read dialogue very fast, and I'm not super familiar with stage directions, and I just felt like I didn't get the full picture, but I'm used to reading prose. I would love to see this play performed. I think it had a very short run, but I would recommend, if you're into plays, going ahead and checking out You Bury Me, because it was very interesting. And I gave it 4 stars out of 5. So the last country that I did was Belgium. This is the country I think I flubbed a bit. I think I bent the rules, but I did it unknowingly, and now I kind of don't really want to go back and try and find another book. I struggled so much with Belgium, guys. I could not for the life of me find a book from my local library to read. So I even started doing some research into Belgian books that I might want to go and buy a copy of myself, but I really didn't feel like it. I'm trying not to be a huge book buyer, mainly for the fact that I don't have a lot of storage for my books currently. So for the sake of a reading challenge, going and buying a new book didn't really appeal to me, particularly when I couldn't find a Belgian book that I was like dying to read that was already on my radar, if that makes sense. So I went real left-wing with this one, and I chose a book called Rubens, which is about the art of Rubens, the Belgian artist, because all I could find on my local library database was fucking Agatha Christie novels, or war novels written by British or American authors, or travel guides. So yeah, I went with this one, and I was like, this would be interesting. It's super, super, super non-fiction, and it's an art book, so there'll be pretty pictures, at least. What I then found out and realized once I picked up the book from the library is that this is by an author called Kristen Loes Belkin. He was American. It is a book about a Belgian artist technically set in Belgium, but is not written by a Belgian author. I think this is bending the rules, but I'm going to consider that it counts because I don't have it in me to go and try find a Belgian book. So let's talk about this book. It was interesting. It was definitely not something I would ever pick up or read unprompted. And I'm going to be so honest, I definitely skim read this one, particularly the further I got into the book. I would say I read this book, but I didn't engage with it hugely. It's just it's a non-fiction book on art. I wouldn't really consider myself an artist. I dabble in digital art, but this is very much a traditional artist back in the 1500s, I believe. When was Reuben? I really enjoyed some of the art involved in the book. Obviously, I'm much more of a looking and taking in art than I am necessarily reading deeply behind the background of the artists themselves or the movements of the time. I think that's just a lack of understanding of basic art history, but also I don't have a huge interest in art history itself. I do love portraits, so I enjoyed looking at his portraits. But after a while, I was kind of I don't think I'm getting much from this book. It's not really the thing for me, and I'm reading this for a reading challenge. I gave this a well-rounded 3 stars because I couldn't really criticize it for the fact that I didn't enjoy it, because it is a book that says what it is on the cover, and that's more of a me problem than it is the problem of the book. And I finished this August 26th, so I did do all of this by August 2025. Those were the 10 books that I read for the StoryGraph Reads the World Challenge 2025. And how am I feeling about it? I feel really positive, happy. I would genuinely always recommend people try out this challenge because it's so fun and it just kind of reinvigorates my reading when I feel like I'm in a slump and I don't really know what to read. Placing those limitations on what I can read is so helpful to me personally, and I just always end up going and reading the weirdest shit I would probably never read, like this Reuben's art book, for example, or that play. And if you're always kind of wondering, I literally don't know what to read next, following something a bit more structured, like tackling a different country at a time, is just a really fun, spontaneous way to do something and widen your literary horizons, which overall is the aim of this challenge. So yeah, let me know if you've ever done a reading challenge. And if you are on the StoryGraph, feel free to follow me. I'm trying to do better at actually leaving written reviews on my books. I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know if you've also read any of these books before. I'd be interested to know. Goodbye everyone, have a good day.